everyone. Good to see you. All right, so wood type printing was developed in the United States in the 1820s. And almost 200 years later, the medium in many ways is nearly dead. That is, nearly dead. Until Jim and his brother Bill Moran moved to Two Rivers, Wisconsin, and revived the Hamilton Type Museum and Printing Workshop. An ambitious feat to say at the least. In April 2009, Jim was hired as the new museum director, and in September 2009, Bill, his brother, was brought in as the artistic director and development coordinator. Longtime typesetters and historians of the medium from Green Bay, the Moran brothers, in taking over the job, have quickly turned the museum's hopes around. And for those of you who saw the movie Typeface, we weren't too sure when the movie ended where the museum would end up. So it's still very much in the process of turning over, but a lot more hopeful now than where it was then. One of the many challenges presented in the movie Typeface was the hundreds of boxes of old type that still needed sorting. Under the Moran's leadership, with the help of tens of volunteers, Hamilton has gone through 129 of the 135 boxes there once was to sort. So to give you a little bit of context, imagine you're opening up a cardboard box and you're looking and you see all of this type of all different sizes, all different fonts. You guys, some of you are in the process now of starting to learn and memorize typefaces. Well, imagine you have this kind of jigsaw puzzle to sort through and figure out. Boxes and boxes of them. Let's see here. So without further ado, I'd just like to say I think we're very fortunate and very happy to have with us tonight Jim Moran of the Hamilton Type Museum.
Thank you. Hi. I don't want it to sound as though I'm responsible for the revival of wood type. I just try to help. There we go. So Hamilton begins 130 years ago next month. And they began somewhat randomly, so that it wasn't as though James Edward Hamilton, the founder of the company, thought this sounds like a really great thing to get into. Wood type is just moving. He was actually a chair maker, twice a failed gold prospector, who wasn't really doing much else until he was asked to make some type. And he was only asked because the local printer knew that he was good with a scroll saw. Anyway, what you're looking at here is the sketch on the left side of the early building in probably about 1890, 1895. And when you consider this is only 15 years after opening, the progress is so fast. You know, I mean, they really have moved along in a hurry, going from a rather small organization to a factory setting. What you are looking at on the right is the factory today. Usually, if people aren't really sure how to get to the museum, I just tell them, look for the smokestack. It's the only one the town has, so it narrows it down in a hurry. But anyway, what Hamilton is a 3-block complex that over time has been bought and sold so that it doesn't really carry the Hamilton name anymore, other than in the museum. It is controlled by Thermo Fisher Scientific. But anyway, so back to Hamilton, and the reason that this whole thing got started is the fact that a local newspaperman needed type to finish a poster. And at that time, all of his competition, or all Hamilton's competition in terms of type manufacturers, were based on the East Coast. So this guy was going to have to wait 3 days to get his type. What Hamilton comes up with is like a veneer type. As opposed to the pieces that I've got over here, this number 2, for example, solid piece of maple routed out of the wood. What Hamilton was doing was much more of creating a thin piece that he mounted onto a cheap block of wood and sold at half the price of all his competitors. The fact that he was in the middle of the country was sort of an added bonus. You've got the double advantage of half the price and getting there half the time. So 1880, from when he begins to 1885, he's already seriously cutting into everybody's business. Now, as you progress more toward, say, 1890, he has so affected all of the other type manufacturers that he's either driving them out of business or he's simply buying them out. Now, this is the crew from, well, it says 1895. And so when you walk into the museum, I've got this as like a 12-foot wide hanging photograph of the crew, those happy guys standing in front of the factory. You know, Hamilton's the guy at the top with the vest on, standing in the doorway. But the thing is, I would always tell people at the beginning of my tour, this is the Hamilton crew of 1882, because that's what I had been told. And so then I took a look at the Hamilton history book that was put together in, I think, 2005. And they document this as being the crew of 1885. And I thought, well, all right, I'll just amend the tour a little bit. That's not a problem. So I was in the corporate offices a couple blocks down a few weeks ago, and they've got that photograph on the wall, and there it is, the caption, the original crew from 1889. So let's just say they were an early group of workers at the museum. It's sort of testament to the fact that this production of wood type expanded so incredibly fast. Now, the type took off in a hurry, and by 1891 they had bought out just about all of the major type manufacturers in the country. The last one, or one of the last ones, was the William Page Company out of Norwich, Connecticut. William Page, I think, probably made the most ambitious styles ever. I mean, almost before or after in terms of the quality. You know, they're not only cutting single colored fonts, they're cutting 2 and 3 color fonts. So these beautiful chromatics, which, by the way, you can see in all of their beauty at the Newberry Library, not too far from here. So, but William Page is, you know, taken wood type cutting to its peak. And truly, you know, 1880 is about the zenith of the whole thing. But when Hamilton buys out William Page, he gets double the amount of fonts that he had. He gets personnel and he gets equipment. So he goes from that veneer method of cutting type to cutting it out of a solid piece of wood. And then proceeds to go on to, you know, dominate the type cutting industry until they stopped making type in 1985. I think American wood type was a very small operation that might have continued, but basically Hamilton was the only game in the country from about 1895 to 1985. So not a bad run. People will remark that 1985 was also the first year of the Mac. I think that's just a coincidence. One of the other things that Hamilton did to try to sort of create this whole monopoly on the organization was expand from type to other type products. Type cabinetry, you know, it's like, well, I'm going to make people all this type, they got to put it somewhere. So he began making type cases and type cabinets to a point where they felt that they could outfit the entire print shop outside of the presses. So Hamilton becomes like the de facto manufacturer of all things printing outside of presses. So if you want it, they will make it and sell it to you. But that also sort of extends the reason why they were so dominant, because rather than just dealing with one product, they moved on and on and on. So this, yes sir.
Just, I don't mean to interrupt you, but can you explain to the students how that type table works? Because they probably wouldn't know the fact that candid top and the rows across hold the...
Oh, sure. The type case there is probably like a double 25 or a double 30, it would be called. In other words, you would have drawers on the right and the left. And so you'd pull it out and you would have a very specific layout for where the letters went. With wood type, it's pretty simple. It's straight alphabetical. With metal type, it's based much more on commonality. So the job case, the printing type case, is broken down with the vowels in the middle, the consonants, and those characters that you're going to use less, exclamation points, question marks, things like that on the periphery. So what happens is, standing or sitting in front of the type case, you have your composing stick, you pull out your drawer and you start pulling out letters to set. As a job is set up or as it's being pieced together, particularly if you're doing a rather large job, you can imagine if you were typesetting a book, for example, you are going to need that sloped space on the top so that you could simply store jobs that might be reused, or if you were doing pages in succession so that you could do page 1 and set it up there and continually on like that. So that was one of the great things that Hamilton did, is develop these cabinets which sort of standardized the press room as well. Composing tables, the big flat tables where you would take the finished layout, lock it into your chase before you put it onto your press. So they're creating all of these different products which are suddenly far easier for the printer to set up their job. I grew up pulling out Hamilton pulls, not even realizing that this company is 45 minutes away from me, but I'm not really alone. I think that all around the country it would be almost difficult to find a printer's type case, job case, that wasn't made by Hamilton. Let's see. So you got the type. And while Hamilton claims to have designed a few faces, I really don't know which ones they were. But what I can tell you is that before he began buying out the other foundries, they had built their way up to about a couple hundred fonts. What I think is kind of interesting about it is the idea of borrowing or stealing other people's fonts is not really that new. What you will find as you look through, say, the early specimen books of Hamilton's, is that take a standard font and you'll see, for example, a French Clarendon that's relatively straightforward. And then you'll see one that's just a little bit wider, a little bit narrower, fonts that are curled instead of straight, slabs that are angled off. And so suddenly that means it's a brand new font, and it's ours. When you look at Hamilton's early specimen books, like going up to 1906, they show not only their fonts, but they show everyone else's fonts as well. And so you have this wonderful teaching guide in terms of typography, so that you could see Hamilton's XXX Tuscan, and then you would see William Page's XXX Tuscan, Heber Wells, Vandenberg and Wells, and Tubbs. These are different manufacturers that, for the most part, preceded Hamilton. But the point being that none of them were above slightly altering a given font and then saying it's ours. Sadly, after 1906, Hamilton has bought everybody out, so all the original sketches and the patterns used to make the type are destroyed, because then it's all been assimilated into the main factory. Kind of sad. So, but the 1907 specimen book has been reprinted by John Horn of Shooting Star Press in Little Rock, so at least you get to see, you know, a little bit of the history and the volume of faces that were offered over 100 years ago. I personally like the slightly earlier one with all of the histories of the other companies, plus you could still order type by telegraph, so, you know, that changed. I was going to say this is the face of the museum today, and it's sort of the face. When the museum opened in 1999, 11 years ago, they built this wonderful sort of drawer pull awning to go over the top of the front doors. And well, it's not there anymore. You know, a strong wind off of Lake Michigan took care of that. So let's just say it looks a lot like what you're seeing there. But the point is we have about 20,000 square feet of space in the museum, and probably another 15,000 just for storage of other equipment and other type. With 1.5 million pieces, well, you know, you got to put it somewhere. But anyway, the progress of the museum begins with volunteers who have no printing background, they don't really have museum background, they have no graphic design background, they're simply local volunteers who are willing to help. And while they got advisors who did a lot of wonderful things toward getting the museum going, they also did a number of things that you might not expect for people who, you know, had kind of an intense approach to printing. But still, you know, any organization that's beginning from square one has to begin somewhere. And they did, I think, a really fine job of getting the thing going and beginning to make what actually is the largest working printing museum in the country, or beyond. Anyway, they finally hired a director in 2004, 5 years after opening, and he kind of moved it forward again. He was a guy with a great art background, with a type of a graphical background and graphic design, so that he was able to maybe expand it a little more. A few more printers made it up there, bringing students. If you did watch the typeface film, you notice that Purdue happens to be one of those that kept coming back. Tends to be more based on the professor's desire to do letterpress printing. But in any case, I think that one of the things, too, we were saying at dinner, which was kind of interesting, is that the previous director wishes he was someone who liked to print. And, you know, when you're in a massive printing museum, you really wish that that would be at least, you know, one of the things you'd like to do. So when he resigned in March of last year, I had been volunteering on a regular basis. I had been coming down from Green Bay, where I was working as a printer, and putting in more and more time. And I mean, I really loved the place because you could see the massive potential that it had. I grew up basically as a printer. My father and my grandfather were both printers, so I started at it pretty much when I was about 16 years old and really never did anything else. So I began in sort of a traditional way where you start as an apprentice and then you become a pressman. In my case, I then became partner and then owner. But small print shops, which used to exist, you know, every half mile, are much like small grocery stores or small drug stores or small hardware stores. You know, they tend not to exist after a time, and so you know, we kind of gave in to the pressure of the chains, and so I had to work for other printers for a while before taking over at Hamilton. Now, give you an idea of what you see when you walk into Hamilton. So we've got display cases that just kind of seem to go on forever, and what we do have, which is kind of great, is the original equipment that was used to make the type. We basically take you from the very beginning to the finished product. So that involves cutting the maple to finishing it to size, the creation of the patterns, because all of the type is created by, almost all the type is created by using a pantograph, which is essentially a tracer and a router. So that as you circle around the pattern, the router is cutting the type. Well, if you're offering 400 different typefaces plus an assortment of dingbats and a variety of clip art sort of pieces, you're going to not only need 400 patterns, but you're going to need them in various increments. Because Hamilton was making type from 3/8 of an inch high up to 3 feet tall on a regular basis. When you go back to 1880 and you realize that the only method of advertising was broadside, you know, this is the only way that you can get your story out. So the fact that, I don't know if you can see it, let's see, way in the back, kind of middle of right, you can see the corner of a number 2. That number 2 is 4 feet tall. If you wanted 4-foot type, Hamilton would make it. But of course, if you're in a larger city, you've got to project your image, and you're going to have to do it from a distance. So they worked in pretty massive sizes. So in addition to the patterns, the other products that Hamilton made, the equipment to make the type, we also have a press room. The great decision, I think, 11 years ago was that this be a working museum, because static displays are fine, but the idea that if you come to the museum and you print, chances are you're using type that's 75 to 100, 125 years old. It was made well. And of course, if it was newspaper type, pounding out thousands of copies a day on it, it was going to wear down. But you know, like some of the samples you can come up and see afterwards, obviously a lot of this stuff held up incredibly well. In the press room where we are, this is a workshop from last December. The guy in the hat is Jim Sheridan of Hatch Show Print in Nashville, Tennessee. If you're not familiar with Hatch, then you ought to get familiar with them. They are the best poster printers in the country. Their printing is absolutely gorgeous. Jim is a really good artist and an exceptional printer. He kind of rescued Hatch from obscurity in the early 80s. They are actually a year older than Hamilton, but they had been doing posters for the music industry, minstrel shows, anything, you know, over the years. But what I think is kind of amazing about Jim is that he revived this thing to the point where back in the day they might have done posters for Doc Watson and Earl Scruggs and Bill Monroe, Elvis Presley, but then Johnny Cash, and then Willie Nelson. And so today they're doing posters for Arcade Fire and Death Cab for Cutie and Coldplay. In other words, they've made this incredible transition of going to, you know, from the past to the present with no drop-off. In other words, they've got great designers, and they understand that the poster is an image that sells. It's kind of an interesting thing, this idea that type talks. And, you know, we sometimes take it for granted, and yet we're surrounded by it, you know, constantly. But anyway, you know, the point being that the workshops are something that we run on a regular basis. I think that particular workshop with Jim had maybe 15 people who came from mostly the middle of the country, but you know, we had a couple from New York. They don't seem to mind traveling to print. And in fact, we draw probably better from Chicago than just about anywhere. So that a typical workshop is a 9 to 5 day. I generally run them on Saturdays. It's the easiest time. And I also make them intro in nature so that I can accept people coming in that have absolutely no experience whatsoever. A lot of times I'll get graphic designers who are quite good at design. 2 weeks ago it was 7 senior designers from Nike, but none of them know how to print. So, you know, they kind of work their way through. And after touring and teaching for about 2.5 hours, then they print the rest of the day. So it becomes a really great experience, and they end up having, you know, maybe 15 or 20 posters that they get to take away from it. The one thing that people do say after a day's workshop is, we were really only getting started. You know, I mean, it almost doesn't seem fair to them that they have to stop after a single day. But, you know, any of you who have taken a studio class understand that you don't go into the studio for an hour or two. You know, if you're involved in sculpture or ceramics, 4 hours is not all that much time. So printing is no different, and from the standpoint that whatever you learn day one ends up being almost as much theory as anything that you get to apply to day two. So one of the reasons that a group from Colorado State came in August was they wanted 3 days. You know, 8 hours was not going to be enough. Well, they also drove straight out, but still, you know, this idea that you can get a lot more out of it by extending it longer than a single day, I think really makes it worthwhile. And one of the things that we often talk about in our workshops is that every facet of it becomes very interesting in terms of learning not only sort of subtle typographical information and printing information, but you know, you begin to look at the cleanup process in terms of layering color and abstractions, so that the approach comes from so many different directions in terms of the input and what you can do during your time. So these are the people. I have a few challenges with running the museum. Maybe the first one being that I'm the only on-site employee, but the other one is these people are incredibly valuable. Mardell Dubeck at the pantograph up top, Bernice Schweikert, type trimmer, and then Jean Petrie on the saw. Now, sounds like I'm introducing a band, I realize. But anyway, the point is there are new methods of doing this sort of thing. You can take a CNC router with vector images, and you can create some really nice type. Not only that, you don't need patterns, so there's a stage that you can avoid. But more importantly, I think there's this incredible craft that these people, you know, continued on while they were there. And so our challenge is to try and create not only recordings to make sort of a living history of the people that worked there, but also to preserve the way it was done. I think that becomes really critical. So toward that end, you know, I try to bring them in when I can. I think Bernice is now 87. She comes in when she wants to, basically. So Mardell is one of our 2 type cutters. A pretty intense skill to understand how to cut not just a sans serif Gothic, but also an italic or a heavily serifed font, and then move on to German blackface, and then Greek, and then Hebrew, in styles that range from, like I said, 3/8 of an inch. I think these days we aren't cutting much more than 12-inch type, but even that's pretty rare because the wood is pretty rare. We have unfinished wood at the plant, and we really need to have it down to that perfect type high, and so that, you know, we kind of struggle with a combination of the funds and just the methods to get prepared wood so that we can cut more type. Because we found out if you need to get more maple, it's about 75 bucks a square foot. So you can imagine, well, just the numbers would be kind of expensive. You know, I guess what I'm saying is that what we're trying to do is embrace the past while sort of moving on to the future as well. This is Norbrilski currently our most regular type cutter with Jim Sheridan, but Norm comes in on a semi-regular basis, and he's in the process of teaching his daughter to cut type, so that, you know, it's just one of those ways that we can sort of keep the thing going. There's a couple of things going on here. The photograph in the top left is from one of the workshops. Sort of the way workshops went in the earlier days. You know, you might have 2 or 3 people. You can see the equipment is often covered in plastic. And like I said, there was nobody on site to teach people to print. So unless an instructor came with the students, taught them, and left, nothing was really happening. So then you kind of fast forward to the picture in the lower right, and the guy on the right side is Matthew Carter, a really great type designer. If you aren't familiar with Matthew Carter, open up your computer tonight and scroll down through your fonts. Chances are you're looking at about a dozen of his. He's just one of the best. And the guy that he is facing is a guy named Rich Kegler. Rich runs the P22 type foundry in Buffalo, New York. Rich does a pretty amazing job of continually adding to metal typefaces that they produce there. He also founded the Western New York Book Arts Center. But, you know, the point is, this is from last year's Ways Goose. Ways Goose, by the way, is a printer's term for a year-end banquet where the apprentice threw a dinner for his fellow printers, with the principal dish being a goose. So we use it a little informally as just a printer's gathering. But the point is, we had about 80 or 90 people at our type conference last year. We had a variety of speakers, like we will this year, but we were a little concerned about what Matthew Carter would think about people playing with his type. The way the project kind of began was Matthew was giving a speech in Boston in about 2004, and he was saying that he had designed type for every possible application. Well, in the crowd was the museum's first advisor, Richard Zoft, who is now dean at Emerson, and he said, well, have you ever designed for wood? And Matthew thought, well, I guess I haven't. So they begin this conversation about, well, what if I design a font that can be used for cutting, and then Hamilton can cut the type. It unfortunately died within about a half a year, but you know, the personnel were just not in place. The style that Carter picked was not a simple style as well, and I think I brought a sample of that. So what we have here is Matthew Carter's Latin streamer font. So rather than just being a straightforward type, it's a chromatic font, meaning that you need to cut both a positive and a negative, or a male and a female part for the type. And historically, when you had 2 and 3 color types, they would have a tendency to overlap. In other words, you had a little trap in there, maybe 3 or 4 points worth of trap. Carter actually wanted to go in the other direction, and he wanted it to be absolutely precise. So anyway, we had difficulty in the creation of the patterns. The job was somewhat revived by my brother Bill a little over, I'd say about a year and a half ago, and then, you know, the idea that we got Matthew Carter to look at his font and to watch people printing with it was actually a thrill for him and for us, because, you know, we thought maybe he'd be offended by it or something. You never know. So the method that we used to cut the type was not traditional. Because we had such a difficulty with the patterns the first time around, what we did was use the CNC router. So you can see the laser in the top left cutting the type, The person that we've used for a couple of these projects is out of St. Paul. His name is Denver Hull. Now that he's getting fairly good at this, he actually has that laser move up and outward so that you get these wonderful corners that the trimmers used to have to do by hand when making type. So you can see both the laser in operation at the top, samples of a few pieces, and then, you know, a black and white version of the two color done as a slightly offset manner. It was one of those interesting things about Carter's type is that when I was talking about how we didn't know how he'd feel about people playing with it, they were printing his type dead on, and then they were moving it off center. They were changing the colors. They were printing it upside down. They were triple running it. You know, in other words, they were doing all kinds of wild things with it, which he thought was absolutely fantastic. A type designer generally doesn't get to see people using his work in that way, and so fortunately for us, he was pretty pleased by the results. Let's see. This is our newest project. In Washington State, the Tulalip tribes have 4 native speakers left. And so with the language in danger of extinction, they decided that they needed to come up with a method of teaching the language to younger members of the tribe. So they decided that the method by which they would do that was going to be a letterpress type camp for the young kids of the tribe. And so they contacted a real impressive Seattle designer named Juliet Shen, who designed the font called Lachute Seed. Now, for those of you who have maybe played around with the creation of type on your computers, you know that there's wonderful software in terms of creating type, but the tribe, number one, wanted a much more organic approach, so that rather than having straight cutoff types, they needed to be slightly rounded. You don't see, well, yeah, I guess you do at the top left. You can see they have a lot of diacriticals, you know, so that as opposed to, say, something as simple as a tilde or an umlaut or an accent mark, you've got a lot of rather unusual characters so that the standard height becomes extremely random. The upshot of that is she created a font that the tribe felt was acceptable, and then we were approached by her to cut the type. So it was cut at the museum and finished in a pretty traditional way. And the language camp this summer, from all reports, came off quite well. But you can imagine this idea. It's one thing to simply be cutting type for somebody who needs replacement letters. It's pretty exciting to even cut a full set, but the idea that you could be involved in language preservation, well, you know, if we don't have much wood, that's certainly a worthy project for it. We've got a few challenges at the museum. Like I said, I'm far luckier than the previous director in that my brother Bill is got a design studio in St. Paul. He can handle my website. He designs a lot of the posters. You'll see a number of them here that were actually his design. But one of the things that Ellen was saying in the introduction is, you see in the movie that we've got 135 miscellaneous boxes of type to be sorted. This is actually the end of the Lachute Seed section, but in the process of opening all of those 135 boxes, there is a lot of work to be done. The 2 students that you're seeing here, Andy and Sarah, are from UW Stout in the western part of Wisconsin. So that, you know, we continually had students that would be coming in, and I think University of Minnesota helped us out. Certainly UW Stout came a number of times, as well as Indiana University. So we're down to 5 boxes. So we've made some progress there. But as you were saying, it's so random. You would open up a massive box and you would find a lot of 1-inch type, and then you'd find something that was, you know, a 1.5 feet tall and completely unorganized. But it becomes kind of an interesting process just in terms of type identification. These guys can identify type way faster than those who did not come. It's just one of those nice processes, and particularly in their case, what we've done is, because they've been returning students, is that rather than charge the customary fee to work in the print studio, they basically trade time. So that they will work for 2 days and they will print for 2 days. It's a lot easier than charging them, and of course I get a lot of much needed work done. So I'm in the process of developing an internship program, and certainly volunteers I take anytime. And you know, while we don't have a policy certainly written or in place, I've had interns from Germany on a number of occasions. I think I had 2 from Madrid this summer, and then across the States. You know, it just kind of depends. Sometimes people walk in and after an hour they say, "Can I work here?" And you know, I certainly don't have a problem with that. I can use the volunteers. Last year I had a woman from Philadelphia do that very thing and spent you know, a few weeks at the museum. Now, one of the things that we're attempting to develop for those who cannot make it to Hamilton is a type library. And the point behind that is, when you open 135 boxes of type, it turns out that you've got a lot of 8-line sans serif Gothic condensed. So, you know, we do not need to display all of it, and because there are a lot of schools that would like to be printing, or they might have a few presses, but they have no type, we've decided that one of the projects we're going to undertake is to begin a type library, so that, you know, we might be able to take, you know, say 300-400 characters, and then they would move from various schools. At present, they're at the University of Minnesota. So, but, you know, at least it's one of those things that, you know, we kind of think we can do in terms of making the museum move a little bit forward. So, you know, I mean, it's a slow process, but I think it's a progressive one. Even in terms of doing small things like Facebook, it allows me to keep in contact with a lot of different people. When the Typeface movie showed in Montreal in late winter, by morning I've got 7 new friends. And within 3 days I got 27 new friends, all from Montreal, or at least a lot of French-sounding people are now my friends. And so, so, you know, you kind of wonder about this, and obviously because I don't know them, you know, they've simply, you know, decided that they're going to be friends of the museum. I simply put out a query saying, you know, what's going on up there in Montreal? Where are you guys printing? And a guy responded and said, there's nowhere to print. You know, I mean, we don't have any facilities up here. Well, you know, maybe that's partly true, but the point is, he and I began a dialogue, and so he then introduced me to a woman named Judith Poiret, who was his instructor at the School of Design in Montreal. And so we went back and forth a little bit. She told me about a very small type film that she had made, and then asked if she could present it at our Ways Goose in 2 weeks. So I said, yeah, absolutely. So, you know, you begin to see how this sort of viral thing begins to catch on, and we, you know, begin to embrace a wider and wider audience, which is sort of our job. You know, we feel like creating opportunities to print, preserving the past, and then sort of moving it on is our job. So I think that's just about it for the slide portion. Yes, an early promotional thing, Good Woods, Wood Goods, was Hamilton's trademark. So that's really it for the talk. I would certainly be happy to answer any questions you have.
Can you talk a little bit about, because I don't think we had have the familiarity with the range of wood type, but can you maybe show a few of the posters and talk about the fact that it's not just type, it's also dingbats and kind of clip art, a full range of really graphic elements were originally created in wood.
Yeah, now some of them were given to us by donation, the Globe Printing Company out of Chicago. We got a lot of marvelous blocks from, and those take the form of rodeo, circus posters, and stock car racing, anything else. But you know, we've got a pretty wide variety. I guess in terms of giving you an idea of the direction that we take it in, I'll show you a few things. A Thomas Paine quote that I put onto paper, talking with other printers. One of the things they assume is that I set 3 lines and printed it and then had to take the type apart and set the next lines, because normally you don't have that many letters. Remember that wood type is much more display type, not text type. So say in newspaper sense, the headlines are the wood and the metal is the text. Another approach to it is simply the specimen sheet. You know, you just take an attractive font and play around with it. In this case, it's a little bit hard to see from here, but it was overprinted. First in kind of a transparent green and then over the top, but a nicely cut font. And you know, when we do those kinds of things, the hope is that we always at least will you know, name them and at least the date they came out, things like that, just to sort of add a little bit more to them. One of the sad things, albeit necessary, for Hamilton was that, you know, you have all these wonderful names for type, you know, the antique, Tuscan, concave, condensed. Not in this case, but it becomes number 763. So not as attractive, but if you're looking it up, more efficient. The broken type poster was a design of my brother Bill's. As you can imagine, we end up with a fair amount of broken type. Actually, quite a good artist from Boston named Janine Wong came out this summer with the intention of printing with nothing but the broken type. But this one is, I think, a pretty successful design, and certainly in terms of sales, it really is. But you know, it's a far more abstract approach than the straightforward setting words into type. You know, this idea that you play around much more with the letter forms and create far more an abstract piece out of it. Out of the Globe collection, this becomes kind of an interesting piece for a few reasons. When we got this collection, it was in nothing that resembled order. So just because you find the green plate does not mean you're going to find a yellow or a red plate, or that it's going to be in any condition that you could actually print from.
You explain to the folks who don't have experience in type, you have to have a separate plate for each color?
Right. 3-color poster, 3 times through the press, 3 printing blocks. So when I'm talking about the fact, thank you, that you can find an image, and you can imagine when you see the word football knocked out on this particular block, you know that there's something missing. So you go searching around for the thing, and hopefully you can find it, and hopefully it's in a condition that's usable. Now in this case, there's the illustrator's name on the piece. That was kind of unusual. Normally these people were somewhat faceless. They worked for a big firm and they designed what they were supposed to. But Studley Burroughs, whose name is on this piece, had already made his claim to fame by illustrating his uncle's Tarzan books. So the guy was the nephew of Edgar Rice Burroughs. But this idea that you have to put the pieces together and print them in order. You know, if you don't print the yellow first and the green second and the red third, you don't get the overall effect of the brown that comes and basically creates the look of a four-color piece.
Let me interrupt one more time.
Mm-hmm.
If you guys are interested in that kind of stuff, you need to take Josh Nichols' print class.
Or come to Intel in January too.
Oh, right.
So a couple of other things where we're, kind of combining some interesting images with type. This was actually a calendar piece that we designed for this year. So we're kind of playing around with it. In the case of the image here, we had a block of these dancing girls. Initially, we simply took a copper gold ink and braided on by hand. Everyone looks different, and then imprinted that over the top, and then come back and print the green on there. So also kind of a nice example of what you can do with darker papers. If you would like to come up and look at some of the others, rather than have me hold every one of them up, I think this was Miss June, but kind of a 1950s style. So it's kind of interesting because you never know what you're going to come up against. Some days it's rather mundane grocery store things. Other times like the Halloween one that we've got over there. So, it's kind of a great thing for me because I get to explore these, and of course it's my job to print every one of them. Somebody's got to do it. So, I don't know, any other questions? If not, I did bring a little bit of type. I think will give you kind of an idea of what Hamilton was doing. This one is more of a hand-carved piece. This is more like the 125-year-old version, but it's in pristine shape, and it's great because we can continue to use it. Our motto a lot of times is preservation through production. Because I've got a museum, I certainly have to be sensitive to the fact that if something is damaged, we may not be able to get it back. But on the other hand, we don't really illustrate the value of this thing by leaving it sit on the wall, right? This is a tool to be used. So that doesn't mean you can use all the type we've got, but still, people who come to the workshops have probably 200 or 300 drawers of type. Some of it a bit larger than this, and certainly a lot smaller that's available for use. Before I forget, I would like to thank you very much for bringing me in. I really appreciate it. So, thanks so much.
Thank you. We really appreciate having you.
Thank you.